Today we're going to go over lots and lots of tips on how we can be as productive as possible by neuroscientist Andrew Huberman. Firstly, we'll be talking about how we can focus as much as possible. Then we'll be talking about how we can learn skills as fast as possible, how we can increase neuroplasticity, and then we'll be talking about sleep because sleep is also extremely important for being productive. So let's start by talking about how we can focus as well as possible. So the first tip would be that we are most productive the first 8 hours of the day, and that is because our epinephrine and our dopamine levels are very high then. And this is great for focus, and dopamine is also great for motivation. And also your prefrontal cortex, this brain region up here, which is there for all the executive functions, planning, decision making and so forth, all the really productive linear tasks. This prefrontal cortex uses up a lot of energy, so you want to make sure that you do productive tasks when you have the most energy, and that is in the morning. And the time when you're the most productive is 4 to 8 hours after your body temperature was the lowest, and the time when your body temperature is the lowest is 2 hours before you naturally wake up. So basically 2 to 4 hours after you naturally wake up is the time when you're going to be the most productive. And then the second tip would be to do tasks for 90 minutes, and these 90-minute cycles are called so-called ultradian cycles. And these, quite interestingly, are also the cycles that we go through during sleep. In the first 15 minutes, this will more or less be the time that it will take you to finally be fully concentrated, and in the first 15 minutes, your mind will tend to wander a lot. However, after that, you're very focused until about 1 hour and 10 minutes after you've started. And the reason why you want to have a 90-minute cycle is because at the beginning of a task, your dopamine levels are quite high, but with time they decrease more and more, and after these 90 minutes you will be totally depleted of dopamine. And by the way, this is exactly the reason why Andrew Huberman's videos on his podcast are always 90 minutes long. It's because he wants to make sure that we listen to his podcast for time that is exactly right for us when it comes to how well we can focus. And then the third tip would be that fasting increases epinephrine levels and therefore makes you more alert. Now obviously we don't recommend fasting all the time because that would basically be anorexia, and we don't want to go down that route. However, one good thing you can do at least every now and then for your focus would be intermittent fasting. And what Andrew Huberman does and thinks is best is that you make sure that you skip your breakfast, because in the morning that's the time when we're already productive anyway, so we might as well use that time to fast so that we're even more productive then. Not only because our epinephrine levels, but also fasting is a good idea for focus, because when we eat we naturally feel more tired, basically because our blood is going to, after we've eaten, when we're digesting, is going to flow towards our gut, and therefore less blood is going to flow towards our brain, and that's why we feel more tired and less productive. And also when it comes to, you've probably already heard this in biology class, there's the parasympathetic nervous system and there's the sympathetic nervous system, which are basically opposites. The sympathetic nervous system is the one in which we feel alert, and the parasympathetic one is basically the rest and digest system. After we've eaten, when we need to digest, we have less energy because we're in this parasympathetic nervous system phase. And if you think about it, it makes total sense that we would be very alert, and that due to our sympathetic nervous system when we're fasting, because that is basically a sign for our body that back in the days when we didn't basically just find food in the grocery store, back when we had to actually hunt to get our food, we would have to feel alert when we haven't eaten for a long time. We'd have to be in the sympathetic nervous system to be able to actually be alert enough to hunt our food. Whereas once we've eaten, we don't need to hunt anymore. And also back then when there wasn't any processed food, when we didn't have food that was very, very dense in carbohydrates and fat, we would have to conserve as much energy as possible, and therefore we would then, when we don't have to hunt our food in order to survive, would try to conserve as much energy as possible, because back in those days it would be very difficult to actually make sure you get enough calories. And then the fourth tip would be that you want to make sure that when you're doing productive tasks that you don't look down but you look up. That's a big problem for most of us, because if you think about it, when it comes to laptops, mobile phones, books, all the things we actually tend to do, especially when we're, for example, answering emails or trying to study, is looking downwards, which is actually a shame for our productivity. If you can, even though it's really difficult, I wouldn't manage to do it, to be honest with you, but if you actually can manage to exercise within the first hour of being awake, this would be really, really, really great for your focus. And if you can't do it in the first hour, as I also can't, at least try to do it in the first 3 hours, because what this does is that it prolongs this phase in which you're extremely productive, and therefore you're not only productive in the morning, in the early morning and mid-morning, but also in the late morning and early afternoon. So now we know how to focus, but it's also really important to know how we can learn skills as quickly as possible if we want to be as productive as possible. So the first tip would be that there are 3 hormones that when these are released at the same time, it is inevitable that we enter a state of neuroplasticity. And these 3 hormones would be epinephrine, noradrenaline and dopamine. Now it's interesting to know which hormones we actually need to release to enter neuroplasticity. However, this information is pretty useless if we don't actually know how we can actually make sure that these 3 hormones are released. So how are they released and when are they released? And this would lead me to the second tip. In order for neuroplasticity to occur, we need to make a lot of errors. And the reason why we need to make a lot of errors is that when we make errors, epinephrine and noradrenaline are released. And it makes sense that our nervous system would only want to change, or would only change if it had to, because there's so many different bodily functions that depend on our nervous system. And if it was easy for our nervous system to change, that would actually be quite dangerous for our bodies. And therefore our nervous system would only change a little bit if it really had to, if there's a signal sent to the brain that is telling the nervous system that something needs to change because we're making errors all the time. So basically we have to get to a place with any skill we want to learn where we feel very, very frustrated because we've reached our limit and we're making all these errors. Now the problem is, of course, that this isn't necessarily very pleasant. It's very frustrating when we keep on making so many errors, which is why most people would probably give up at this point. But as Andrew Huberman explains, this is the worst thing you could do at this point. Instead, what you should do, and this would be the third tip, you want to make sure that in this state in which you're making so many errors, you want to push through even though it's so frustrating for 7 to 13 minutes, because that is the only way we can actually make sure that our nervous system and our brain actually changes. And the best thing to do when you're in this phase, and this would lead me to the fourth tip, would be if you can manage to attach pleasure to this phase. Now this sounds very counterintuitive, because how the heck are you going to manage to be both frustrated and feel good at the same time? It sounds impossible. So how can we actually manage to have a little bit of enjoyment while we're in this frustrating process? And a great way to do this would be to tell yourself while you're in this frustrating phase that this frustration is a sign of you making progress and that it's good for you in the long term. That, for example, would be a way in which you can actually make sure that you feel good and therefore release dopamine. And this is very important. As I've already explained, you need 3 hormones in order to enter neuroplasticity, and if you are only frustrated, then you're only releasing noradrenaline and epinephrine. However, you also want to make sure that dopamine is being released, because these three hormones have to be released at the same time, and that's why you want to kind of attach this pleasure and this enjoyment. By the way, Andrew Huberman once mentioned that one of the worst things you could do for your dopamine levels is, instead of telling yourself that you're kind of enjoying this process, the worst thing you could do would be instead telling yourself that you really, really hate the process, but you would really want the results, because this really, really undermines your dopamine levels. Now, the fifth tip would be that you want to make sure that your sleep quality is really good. In this phase in which you're making all these errors, this just triggers that your brain is going to rewire itself. But the actual rewiring of the brain actually happens during sleep. Many people want to somehow sleep less to become more productive, but this is very, very counterproductive, because we need sleep to be able to be productive in the first place. So just cutting down on sleep in order to have more time makes us, yes, have more time, but it also makes us less productive, which is why we're also going to talk about sleep now. So the first tip would be that you want to make sure that you don't see any light from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. because if you do, what happens is that a brain region called the habenula is activated, and this leads to your dopamine levels decreasing. And this is why this brain circuit is called the disappointment circuit. It's because it makes you release less dopamine, and therefore you feel disappointed. And this is why shift workers are more prone to depression and suicide. In fact, it turns out that many people who commit suicide, when you look at their sleep schedule weeks before, you notice that their sleep schedule was totally messed up before they committed suicide. And then the second tip would be that the best body temperature for sleeping as well as possible would be 18 degrees Celsius. And a study has found that at a body temperature of 18 degrees Celsius, we fall asleep way more quickly, and we also have a prolonged phase of deep sleep. So basically this stage of sleep which is called slow wave sleep. Slow wave sleep has actually increased 10 to 20%, which is a lot. Now, hearing this, that you need to have a lower body temperature, you might think to yourself, especially if you've watched many podcasts by Andrew Huberman, oh great, cold showers are supposed to be really healthy for us. How about I take a cold shower right before I go to bed so that my body temperature is lower? And yes, cold showers are very beneficial for your health and all sorts of different things. However, you don't want to have a cold shower before you go to bed, because your body adapts to the cold temperature by warming itself up. So a cold shower doesn't cool your body down, instead it actually increases your body temperature. And also another reason why you don't want to have cold showers before you go to bed is that then your body will release cortisol and adrenaline, and you definitely don't want to release these hormones before you go to bed, because you want to make sure that you feel relaxed when you go to bed, and of course if your body releases stress hormones, it won't feel relaxed. So instead what you want to do is the very opposite. You want to make sure that you have a warm bath or so before you go to bed, because then your body adapts by cooling its body temperature down. And then the fourth tip would be to make sure that you dim your lights in the evening, because this is what makes sure that you then produce melatonin, which is really important for sleep. Now you might think, okay, great, I'll just wear blue blocking glasses all day so that I don't see any blue light and I sleep as well as possible. Blue blocking glasses can be very beneficial in the evening before you go to bed. However, you really don't want to make sure that you wear blue light blocking glasses in the morning and afternoon, because what then happens is that your eyes actually become more sensitive to blue light, and therefore in the evening already very, very little light will make you feel awake. Now you might think, okay, so if I want to increase my melatonin, so if I want to have high melatonin levels in order to sleep better, maybe I should take melatonin. However, Andrew Huberman doesn't actually think taking melatonin is a great idea, and this would be the 5th tip, because if you actually take melatonin, so there are basically 2 problems. When you take melatonin, it actually makes you release melatonin more in general and not only before you go to bed, and this can have an impact on your other hormone systems, which is why you definitely don't want to, if you've got kids or if you are a teenager, you definitely don't want to take melatonin then, because it actually suppresses the onset of puberty. And of course, you want to make sure that you actually grow well when you're supposed to grow. And the second problem, and I think this is a much, much bigger problem, is that Matthew Walker once explained, and he's an expert on sleep, what they write on these bottles, it can actually quite often be the case that there's only 15% as much as is listed on the bottle, or it could also be that there's 400 times more than is listed on the bottle. When it comes to melatonin supplements, they don't actually strictly stick to how much melatonin they actually say is in there. That seems to, at least for me and Andrew Huberman, be a big problem. If you want to know about more tips by neuroscientist Andrew Huberman, you can watch this video here.